Are Fender and Gibson ripping us off? Hey everybody, Jace Allen here. Welcome back to the channel. I review a lot of cheap guitars on this channel, and oftentimes I talk about how mid-price guitars are a much better deal than name brand Gibson or Fender guitars. But are Gibson and Fender guitars overpriced? Are Gibson and Fender ripping us off? Let's find out. The Gibson Guitar Company began in 1902 right here in my home state, in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Then called the Gibson Mandolin Guitar Manufacturing Company Ltd., Gibson's namesake Orville Gibson began making instruments in 1894. The Gibson Les Paul was introduced in 1952. That makes the Les Paul guitar over 70 years old. By comparison, Leo Fender began making guitars in 1940, a lap steel guitar. Around 10 years later, he would invent the Telecaster and then the Stratocaster, two iconic guitars known the world over to this very day. So what would a Gibson Les Paul set you back in, say, 1960? The 1960 Gibson guitar catalog lists the Gibson Les Paul Standard in cherry sunburst finish at $265. If we adjust for inflation, that would put the Les Paul in today's money at $2,834.09, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation calculator. Today, a Gibson Les Paul Standard 50s plain top dark cherry sunburst costs $2,599, plus tax and shipping if applicable. So those statistics tell us that a Gibson Les Paul guitar has kept pace with inflation. But that doesn't tell the entire story. The average household income in the U.S. in 1960 was $5,600. The average U.S. manufacturing worker made about $2.26 an hour and worked about 42 hours a week on average, resulting in an annual income of $4,700. That means it would take an average factory worker about 117 hours to save enough money to purchase a Gibson Les Paul guitar in 1960. Today, the average household income in the U.S. is $80,610. The average U.S. factory worker makes about $18 an hour, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The 1960s factory wages adjusted for inflation would mean that a factory worker in the U.S. should be making $24 an hour. So now it would take a factory worker 144 hours to save enough money to purchase a Gibson Les Paul guitar. That's of course not taking into consideration all the other expenses people have just to live. Average home prices in the U.S. in 1960 were around $11,900, which adjusted for inflation today would be $127,266. The average home price in the U.S. today, however, is a whopping $420,000. A car in 1960 costs on average $2,752, which adjusted for inflation should be about $29,430. But again, the average price of a new car today is around $50,000. So it would appear on the surface that the price of guitars isn't the problem. It's that wages are not keeping pace with inflation, yet prices for other goods are rising faster than inflation. I'm self-employed and take home about $700 a week. Luckily, the house that we live in is paid for. It was passed down from my wife's family. I make about $500 a month from YouTube, so I could buy a Gibson Les Paul outright after saving my money for about 4 or 5 months, depending on other gear that I plan to buy. So in order to review guitars in the $2,000 to $3,000 price range, I would only be able to review 3 or 4 guitars a year. So when I talk about cheap guitars versus expensive guitars, I'm not trying to disparage expensive brands or even try to convince people not to buy a Fender or a Gibson. What I am trying to do, however, is save people some money. There are plenty of great guitars out there from $150 on up to $500. Obviously, the lower you go in price, the more issues you might find with things like quality control. But a $200 to $300 guitar will usually be a great buy. It'll play great, it'll sound great, it'll look great. I know that for a long time I felt that if I didn't spend some money and get a brand name guitar, that I couldn't possibly sound professional. But I discovered that I sound the same whether I'm playing a $150 guitar or a $3,000 guitar. So if you're feeling like you're missing out because you don't have a Fender or a Gibson guitar, you're really not. Are those guitars good, though? Yeah, of course they are. They are the brands that basically invented the guitars we all play today. Should you buy one if you have the budget? Why not? Should you expect a $2,500 Les Paul to sound far better and play better than a cheaper Epiphone or even a Firefly or Harley Benton? Probably not. You might be surprised how good the cheap brands really are. So what does the future of USA-made guitars look like? Well, one thing that I haven't touched on when it comes to the cost of USA-made guitars is the fact that streamlined manufacturing processes and CNC machine technology have made guitar building far easier and more efficient than it was in 1960. I don't know for a fact, but I'm guessing the amount of human labor involved in building a guitar is far less nowadays than it was in 1960. So in theory, USA-made guitars could be priced lower than they are. But then again, Gibson did file for bankruptcy protection in 2018. Was it because their instruments cost too much and that average people can't afford them? It could come down to a symptom of their pricing strategy. People simply don't have the budget for very expensive guitars. Even the Epiphone line has gone up in price over the years, putting some of those models out of reach of many people. I think Gibson will find that they will need to eventually bring the cost of their guitars down to stay competitive. And with the threat of tariffs looming large for 2025, we could see a massive shift in guitar pricing. Maybe the used market will explode. Only time will tell. So in conclusion, no, Fender and Gibson are not overpriced. They're not ripping us off, especially if you consider their prices adjusted for inflation. They're in line with what they've always been. But other factors like stagnant wages and the high cost of living means that their guitars are probably out of reach for many players, especially young people or beginner guitar players. I think they will continue to be considered the gold standard of guitars for maybe another 5 to 10 years. But as the boomer generation passes away and younger people start exploring other more inexpensive brands, things could get difficult in the future for the big brand names. At the end of the day, there are lots of options for guitars in all price ranges, so don't feel like you have to stick with Fender or Gibson. I'm Jace Allen. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.